Welcome. This is James Corbett of the Corbett Report with your EyeOpener Report for BoilingFrogsPost.com. When SOPA and PIPA, the House and Senate bills to impose draconian regulations on the internet in the name of protecting intellectual property rights, broke through into public awareness late last year, it caused an immediate, widespread grassroots protest movement to rise up. With some of the biggest websites on the internet staging a one-day blackout to raise awareness of the legislation, millions were mobilized against it. So loud was the opposition to these bills that they were postponed on the legislative agenda and effectively killed off. The lesson was a valuable one on several levels. Firstly, it demonstrated that even a corrupt, fundamentally broken system like that of the US Congress still needs at least the pretense of public support to forward its legislative agenda, and that the people, when adequately informed and mobilized, can derail that agenda. More soberly, it also demonstrated that the battle against the special interests that are lobbying for this agenda is certain to be a war of attrition. At the time, many analysts, myself included, warned that the death of SOPA and PIPA was not the death of tyrannical IP legislation altogether, and that the same interests would regroup under another banner again and again until their wishes were hardwired into law. Soon after, that warning was realized as the public suddenly became aware of ACTA, a multinational treaty to establish intellectual property enforcement standards amongst a group of industrialized nations. Once again, the call to action was sounded, and this time it was the Europeans who heeded that call, with activists staging protests, petitions, and awareness campaigns from Poland to Slovenia to Sweden. Once again, a crisis was averted as the ratification of the treaty in its signatory states, which seemed a virtual certainty before the protests, became an uphill battle for ACTA's proponents, effectively stalling the deal in its tracks. Still, the very nature of the deal made it more difficult to combat. As a treaty, it could bypass the legislatures of many of its signatory states, almost removing the public from the debate altogether. As a result, protest was less coordinated and less effective than it had been against SOPA and PIPA. Now, many of the same issues are on the table yet again. This time the culprit is another impenetrable acronym, TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Negotiations on this deal have been underway for years, but taking place completely behind closed doors, meaning the only understanding we have of what is contained in the deal comes from leaked copies of draft negotiation documents. This deal, like ACTA, seeks to create a standardized regulatory framework for dealing with intellectual property issues, as well as other trade-related issues between a range of Pacific nations. And it has so far flown almost completely under the radar. Last month I had the chance to talk to Niall Bowie, an independent journalist and photographer based in Malaysia, about the treaty and its provisions.
Now, the TTP is basically what's disguised as a free trade deal. It's essentially what I feel is the corporate usurpation of rights and privileges that really put that undermine national governments in many ways. And what this TTP agreement is, it's been negotiated in secret, and it's been organized by over 600 multinational corporations. Members of the U.S. Congress have complained because they've not been able to view the negotiation drafts and the draft texts. And if we look at other free trade agreements like the FTAA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, that was after 2 years of negotiations. All the text was made available. But here we are with almost 3 years now into the negotiations of the TTP. We've not seen anything. We do have a couple leaks, which I'll talk about in a second, but from the research I've done, the agreement is not to release any information about the TTP until 4 years after the negotiation ended in October 2013. So this is quite insane. And I think if we look at what comes with this, there are basically the Hollywood copyright cartels are really benefiting here. What we see is there's been a leaked chapter on investment that's come out, and this has contained a lot of really interesting information. Now, if we look at the 1997-1998 Asian financial crisis, Malaysia was a country that recovered quickly than the other countries because they employed protectionist economic policies against the Malaysian ringgit. This is under Mahathir Mohamad. And what we have here under the TPP, that will ban any kind of capital controls. So Malaysia would have no means to shield itself against any sort of financial manipulation, currency speculation, derivative trade. So it's very alarming.
For years, the treaty negotiations have been taking place under total secrecy. The public was not allowed to know what terms were being discussed because, as U.S. Trade Representative Ron Kirk argued, public disclosure had killed trade deals in the past, like the Rockefeller-backed free trade area of the Americas. By this logic, the less the public knows about what their so-called representatives are doing, the happier everyone will be. So far, everything we know about what has been discussed in these negotiations come from documents that have been leaked to the public by concerned officials behind the scenes. These leaks have confirmed the public's worst fears about what provisions the treaty contains. One of the organizations that has been fighting to bring awareness and transparency to the TPP process is the Electronic Frontier Foundation at EFF.org. They're currently hosting the leaked negotiation documents and are covering the ongoing negotiations in the face of a virtual media blackout. Last week, Myra Sutton, International IP Coordinator for the EFF, joined me on Corbett Report Radio to discuss some of the treaty's most worrying provisions. Well, let's start talking about some of those problems, because as you say, the leaked draft texts at least give us an idea of what types of issues they're working on and what proposals they're considering. So let's talk about some of the specific points in the IP chapter, the intellectual property chapter, that have you so concerned.
All right, so the TPP would not extend U.S. Policies as much as it would for the rest of the signatory countries. That's because we have one fairly good case law that allows us, that protects and I guess pushes back against the restrictions that copyright enacts. And two, because we have fairly flexible fair use. And so the most latest leak that we got last month was related to what we call exceptions and limitations. Exceptions and limitations are exceptions to copyright, and these exceptions are things like education and for libraries, things like that, that put a limit to these enforcement measures in copyright to ensure that even if material is copyrighted, necessary institutions like schools can have access to such content. While we were in San Diego in July, they suddenly released a blog post out of nowhere that they would enact fair use into the TPP. There was no fair use in the TPP before then, but so it seemed like good news at first, but when we looked at the actual provision that they were talking about, they call this thing the three-step test. And what this three-step test, to summarize, it sort of limits the kinds of fair use that other countries can enact in their own countries. So instead of each country being able to determine, what kind of exceptions to copyright do we want to make so that we protect these vital institutions, it sort of ties the hands of each of these countries from being able to make those determinations. So the U.S. is unfortunately pushing forward these restrictions on fair use, and that has a very broad implication for the many other side effects of this IP provision. There are more specific problems. One provision of the IP chapter regulates temporary copies. So when you watch a video on the internet, on YouTube or anything, it has to temporarily save a file on your computer so you can actually literally see it on your screen. The way that the language of the TPP is written is very broad, and so there are some very heavy implications and broad interpretations that can arrive from such broad language that regulates any video that you watch on YouTube. So essentially, if you watch a copyrighted video, you could be determined to have infringed on copyright, and that's pretty ridiculous.
The latest round of TPP negotiations are currently taking place in Leesburg-Virginia and are scheduled to continue until September 15th. So far there has been nothing approaching the type of awareness or protests surrounding this deal that there was around SOPA and PIPA, or even ACTA. With each battle in this ongoing war of attrition, it seems that the public is becoming more confused, lethargic, and apathetic. Faced with a bewildering array of bills, treaties, and trade deals, each obscured behind its own bland acronym, it seems that the powerful corporate interests who are lobbying for ever greater restrictions on the internet are using the public's collective attention deficit disorder to their advantage, and are closer than ever to achieving their goal of hardwiring draconian free speech clampdowns into law under the guise of protecting intellectual property. As unsatisfying as it may be, surely the public must continue to inform itself of these issues and must maintain the momentum of opposition to movement on the IP front. Like any war of attrition, the only surefire way to lose is to stop fighting. But in the long term, a public that is constantly fighting back against the assault of a powerful corporate lobby will never be able to evolve out of the current intellectual property paradigm that is the root cause of this mess. Ironically, in the long term, the real hope for the general public is the very internet that the corporations are seeking to suppress. Empowered by a medium that makes the worldwide distribution of independently produced art, music, video, and news possible for the first time in human history, we are as a society on the cusp of completely circumventing the Hollywood, music label, publishing industry death grip on our news and entertainment. This is the real reason that DVD and CD sales are declining so precipitously. Not piracy, but apathy. Who wants to buy a subscription to Time magazine when you can buy a subscription to Boiling Frogs Post? Who wants to support a major music label when you can directly support an independent musician? This is the secret that the corporations don't want us to contemplate, that their end is nearer than we think. In the final equation, perhaps the real war is not the war against the IP provisions that the multinationals are trying to lay down into law. Perhaps it is the copyright paradigm that has allowed these corporations to flourish. If so, then the most effective way for the public to once again gain the upper hand is to support the independent producers of open, Creative Commons licensed media, and to simply withdraw our support from the old media paradigm altogether. This video is brought to you by the subscribers of BoilingFrogsPost.com. For more information on this and other topics, please go to BoilingFrogsPost.com. For more information and commentary from James Corbett, please go to CorbettReport.com.